In the second part of the Springback Visitors book, we're going to finish making the lever, then we'll make the spring and attach that. We will make the split boards and attach those, and we'll cut the leather and apply the corners. We'll start by making the split boards. I'm using 1.6mm grey board for the inner board and 2.4mm for the outer board, giving a total thickness of 4mm for the boards. You can make the boards at any stage. I think I actually did make these quite early on. I make them almost 2 inches oversize, and then we'll trim them up when it comes time to attach them to the lever. Thank you for the feedback on the colours for the book cloth. I got a wider range of responses than I expected. I'll talk about that more at the end of the video, since we're not going to apply the cloth today. Now that we know what the final thickness of the book at the spine is, we'll make the spring now. So the first step will be to measure how far or how large the spring is, how much it's going to wrap around the book. Now I want the spring to go onto the lever 5mm. So I'll put a mark 5mm onto the spring either side and use a scrap of paper to measure the distance around. It comes to 48mm, but I round it up to 50mm since there'll be a small gap between the spring and the spine. Now I'm going to make the spring out of 2 pieces of 1mm board. So the inside board will be 50mm, and the outer board has to have an extra radius of 1mm, and the radius is proportional to pi, so I'll add an extra 3mm. So 50mm and 53mm. So I'll wet these quite well to make them nice and soft. So I'm going to wrap this spring in white paper. This is a strong white paper. It's Permalife, the high content cotton content paper, but any strong paper will do. And I'll make it roughly 3 times the width of the spring, and I'll have the double layer on the inside, sort of on the theory that the most pull will be on the inside of the spring. So I'll just crease the paper so that when I put the adhesive on it, it's an easy matter of wrapping the paper around the grey board. The thickness of the book at the spine is roughly 25mm, so I'm going to wrap this around a 25mm dowel. And this is my latest trick. I put a couple of thin pieces of grey board, they're 5mm wide, and they're the same thickness as the laminated grey board that makes up the spring. So in this case it's 2mm. And I put them either side, and it just reduces the damage to the edges of the spring when it gets rolled up in the paper on the dowel. I had so many failed springs because the edges of the springs had become compressed and the paper had got all screwed up, and I was trying to work out a way to stop that happening, so I gave this a go, and it works pretty good. So it's working for me. No one told me about it. I haven't read about it in any books. But then again, I'm definitely not following, say, Mason's instructions for making the spring, because they're quite complex, and I might work up to them one day, but they're not the sort of thing, the instructions aren't the sort of thing that everyone's going to be able to do. Not everyone's going to use hide glue and then heat up the spring on a gas burner and things like that. So for now we'll do it this way, and I imagine I'm going to be improving springs for a long time to come. So I wrap the spring up as tightly as I can in the craft paper. This is just a medium weight craft paper, there's nothing special. It's just taped to the dowel, and once it gets too damaged, too much squeeze out gets on it and stuff like that, then you can just pull it off and get a new piece. I like the craft paper because it absorbs moisture. So I leave it a couple of hours to let the adhesive start to set up. Now we need to shape the spring from this semicircle into a C shape, sort of a bit like that, but without shoulders quite as deep. That's a reject spring. Now you can use your fingers, and that's what I did with the cloth covered notebook. But again, I did find that using your fingers, there's a good chance you damage the edge of the spring. So I started experimenting with other ways, and I was also influenced by doing the workshop with Daniel Ibbott. Daniel he has a thing called a roller backer, and it's this device where you put the book into this machine. It's got these jaws, and it's got a big roller that backs the book and puts shoulders on it. But he suggested, or he'd been shown, to put the edges of the spring in the jaws. You can adjust the jaws, do them up, and shape the spring that way. And I gave it a go at his workshop, and it worked really well. And I was trying to think of what I had that was a bit like that, and I thought of my band nippers. And this works pretty good too. Maybe not quite as good as Daniel's roller backer. The other thing I thought of was just using a steel ruler, and this actually worked really well also, because a lot of people aren't going to have band nippers, and band nippers aren't a cheap toy either. Once you get it started, then using your fingers to shape the C is much easier. So once you get the edges turned in a little bit, just use your fingers to start flattening it and make a C shape that's going to fit on the book. The other thing I've been doing is just using the book to help shape it as well. Just put it on the spine of the book and shape it on the book. You can see it's fitting really quite well there. So I just work it a little bit more. I don't want to overwork it. I don't want to damage the integrity of the grey board. I think one of the advantages of the old method of using hide glue and using heat, you reactivate the glue, and so you wouldn't do as much damage to the structure of the spring, whereas potentially I think working it like this could damage the fibres in the spring. But so far I've had good luck with it, and the springs have seemed to have held up really well. So once you get the right shape, just put it between some bricks, just squeeze them in slightly, a couple of mil, just to give a little bit of extra tension, so it's a nice snug fit when it's applied to the book. Like that, and then I put the spring in the sun for a day, and that seems to really dry it out and make it really hard. Okay, so let's make the levers and the tabs that go underneath. So I'm using about an inch. I take off about an inch. It's probably too much. In hindsight, I wish I'd done more like 15 millimeters. And then this cut for the tab, I go in maybe an inch past the tape. So the tab doesn't need to be very thick. The main purpose of this tab is for the turn-ins, to allow the turn-ins. Now, what I should have done with those end cutouts is by 15 millimeters, because I'm doing 20 millimeter turn-ins on this book, the chamfered part at the ends would have overlapped the turn-ins, and that is the goal, but I took a little bit too much off and they don't quite reach the turn-ins. I also did 20 millimeter turn-ins this time, and these larger springbacks with the sheepskin, so far I'd done 25 millimeter turn-ins, and I just mustn't have been thinking That's the trouble with doing these videos in the evenings after doing my day job. Now, having tins is really useful for making springbacks. I think you could get by with some stiff card. I'm using the tin here so that I don't cut into the end papers, but also the tins are really handy for putting on the split boards and compressing them really firmly shut. Now it's really important to get the angle of these cuts right so that the tabs on the inside and the lever is on the outside. Now just trim up the width so that they'll fit inside the lever. Theoretically you do it at 1/4, but I made the split boards so it's close to 1/3, so I can go a little bit past 1/4. I can't remember what it is, but I want to go enough past the manila stiffener so that I get these steps, so that the thickness of the lever sort of is gradual. It thins gradually so that nothing will show through the split board. So after a day in the sun, the spring was really nice and stiff. Now I noticed a little bubble underneath the paper on the outside. I've had this happen a couple of times, and I thought I'd just leave this in. It was a really easy fix. I just slip where the bubble is and use a micro spatula to push a bit of PVA in and fix it, and it's almost invisible once it's been fixed. Now we'll cut a piece of cloth to attach the spring to the lever. So it needs to just be a little bit less than the width of the central lever and wrap around. We'll adjust the size so that again it helps with this thinning of the lever towards the outer edge. So I'll cut it to height. I put a couple of little marks on the spring so I know where to put the adhesive. The spring, the ends, because I make it well oversized, often the ends aren't perfect, and so you sort of pick the end that's the best and put it more towards the better end. Now you really need to make sure this piece of cloth is really well adhered into the spring, because you really don't want it pulling out. There's a lot of the mechanical force is on this piece of cloth. I like to leave it a couple of hours at least to make sure that the adhesive is well and truly set, and then we can force it onto the book. Now we want to make sure that it's really well and truly on the book. So we don't want it we want the smallest gap possible between the spine of the book and the inside of the spring. Now it's well attached, we can adjust the width of the cloth and then glue that down. Now it's time to prepare the split boards. So I'll straighten up the inside edge, then square up one end. I'll measure the length of the text block, and I'm going to put 4mm squares on this book, which is the thickness of the boards. So I'll measure the height of the book, which is 292 plus 2 times 4, which is 8. So we'll make the boards 300mm high. We don't have to adjust the width of the boards at this point. We'll do that after we've attached them to the book. I think I've mentioned these bench hooks in other videos. They're a great little tool if you don't have a dedicated space for bookbinding. I don't normally use them in my workshop because I have a piece of wood that runs along the back of my bench, and I can use that to put a square up against to square off a board. The only trouble is then I'm reaching right in front of the camera, so for filming these little bench hooks are quite handy as well. As usual, I'm going to use cotton sash cord to form the groove between the spring and the split boards. I'm using 6mm diameter cord, and the leather is 1mm thick, so I'm going to make the gap between the boards and the spring 8mm. Put a couple of marks 8mm in from the spring at the head and the tail. Get the board in place with the 4mm squares, and then I like to put lots of registration marks on the split board and a line along the lever and on the outside of the end papers, so that I've got as many advantages as possible when applying the split board with the adhesive. With the quite thick board and the fairly thick lever with the leather, which is sort of grabby, these split boards take a bit of pressure to apply, and especially if you're fairly new to applying these split boards, it's worth doing a number of trial runs without adhesive just to get used to getting them in place as quickly as possible. I'm going to use PVA as the adhesive, so it will key pretty quick. When I first started doing split boards, I did use mix to give myself a little bit more open time. I've put some silicone coated baking paper around the tins and got those ready before I started applying the adhesive. So force some adhesive right down into the split boards to make sure there's no voids in the split board, and be careful not to let it go closed once you've applied the PVA, because you don't want it gluing itself shut. So ironically, even though the adhesive is a fast keying adhesive, initially it does provide a little bit of lubrication and make it easier to position than doing it as a dry run. Put the tin in place, which also protects the text block from any squeeze out. Turn it over and do the other side. You don't want to muck around because you need to get the pressure on the split boards as quickly as possible to get them closed up. Now, I made a bit of a mistake here initially, but I picked it up fairly quickly. The tins have to go underneath the tabs because we want to push those tabs up into the gap. So I've got them wrong there. Now that's the right way. So the tab gets pushed up into the void that's left by the absence of the lever, I guess. I know I didn't explain that very well, but the first time you make one you'll understand what I mean. Now put a solid pressure on those to close those up and leave them a couple of hours at least. Here you can see where those tabs are pushed into the inside piece of grey board. Okay, now it's time to trim the foredge of the split boards, or the boards. Sort of gone 4.5 millimeters. Oh, something else I didn't mention is now that the boards are attached, the book is almost operating as a springback, which makes it a pain in the neck to trim this foredge, because you've got the book trying to force itself closed on you. And as a 4mm laminated board, it's pretty stiff as well and hard to cut through. I've been asked why I don't take it out and cut the boards on my board cutter. Well, normally with thinner board it takes longer to walk out to the other room where the board cutter is than to just do it by hand. Plus, not everyone has a board cutter. Now we'll mark the book up for the spine leather and the corner pieces. So we'll make the spine leather so it goes 1/4 of the width of the book, so from the outside of the spine to the foredge, which is the standard. Now in the corner, I was always taught that distance was the diagonal, but I like the corners on my springbacks to be a bit smaller. So if you use that distance as the distance along the edge instead of diagonally, it makes the corners a little bit smaller, and I think it looks better on these large books. And also the examples that I've studied in the archives, I think that's the case as well, that the corners tend to be a little bit smaller. I haven't seen anything documented about this practice. To trim up the excess spring, I just wrap a piece of paper around so that it's level with the top of the boards, and just mark that around the spring. Now, all the instructions that I've found say to provide a little bit of excess, which will be used to help form the head cap. I think one of the descriptions is sort of a crescent. So I've done that. But I've only added a millimeter. So I'll cut it so that it angles down, so it ends up level with the top of the boards and about 1 millimeter higher at the outside of the spine. The last one I did, I had too much material and it was hard to form the head cap. So I try to not overdo this. I only just give it 1 millimeter and that's all. Just trim it up and make it nice and neat. It doesn't have to be too neat though, because we are going to beat the living daylights out of it and smash it up. Quickly back corner the boards, so just put a 10 in so you protect the text block. Should actually put a piece of card underneath above the tin to protect the blade of your knife. Didn't get the camera work very good there. I think I've mentioned the cameraman's pretty average. I like to ease off the edges of the boards and slightly round the corners. I normally don't do this on my main workbench. I normally take this somewhere where I don't mind making a mess, but for the ease of videoing, I'll do it here. I'm using unfinished sheepskin for this book. Sheepskin is very traditional for springbacks, but it's normally done reverse. I think for customers, I think they'd prefer to have it grain side out. So I'm just using a scrap piece of this leather to measure the width of the spine piece. I push it into the groove when I do that. And I always add 4mm for a large book just for good measure. Now here's a piece from Birdsall leather. Whenever possible, I like to put the spine of the animal on the spine of the book, and that's what I'm going to do in this case. This leather is about 1mm thick, or the manufacturer says between 0.8 and 1mm, but I've found it to be very uniform, right on 1mm. This hide cost just under $40 Australian, so that's about $30 US. So if you're after cheap sheepskin leather, then I think even with postage from Australia, this is probably pretty good value for money. I'll put a link in the description to the manufacturer of this leather. Of course, I buy all my own stuff. I'm not getting paid to endorse them, of course. Now I wasn't sure whether to show this or not, but this is making the little template for cutting out the corners. So I'll just square up a corner, cut a corner piece that's the right size to give a 20mm turn in. So that's the width of the corner plus two 20mm turn ins. I'll also just score the 20mm turn-ins just so I know where that is, and then I'll cut off the corners. I'll cut the corner off 5mm away from the actual corner of the boards. So it's the boards are 4mm thick, so that gives 1mm to wrap around the board. Now of course I've rounded the boards off a little bit, so once I've made this template I'll put it underneath the boards and just take a shade off to adjust it down to 5mm. I'll use a sharpish bone folder to mark out 4 corner pieces. I'll try and use the leather as best I can. I normally do 5 in case I mess one up, but I just forgot this time, and I didn't mess any up, so that was okay. If this is your first go at doing leather corners, then I recommend making 8 of them and using 4 of them to do a practice board. So I'm just going to edge pair all these pieces of leather. As always, I always strop my knife before I start, and I'll usually strop it a couple of times while I'm pairing as well. I won't pair the joints because in a springback you want the book to be as strong as possible. If there's one downside to this sheep leather, it's that it's really quite stretchy, and it's a little bit harder to pair. It's not too bad. As usual, wet the outside of the leather and then glue up with starch paste. So we'll try and pleat the corners. Unfortunately, the cameraman did a shocking job again while I was doing the corners. The thing I worry about most doing these videos is teaching people bad habits. I worry that I've picked up bad habits and that I'll pass them on to you. And right at the moment, you're seeing my two worst bad habits. Fingernails should never touch wet leather, and you shouldn't rub wet leather either. Now, lots of people do, and the real masters that never do it, I guess, what they'll say to you is that if you do it and get away with it, then you're exactly that. You've been getting away with it. But a fingernail mark in a piece of leather just doesn't go away. I guess my excuse is that I'm only doing it where I'm doing the pleats, and I guess they just blend with the little tiny pleats. I'm just using my fingernails to help form those pleats. Well, it's just my thumbnails, I guess. And I guess I have no real excuse for rubbing the leather on the corners. If you do want to rub leather, you should do it through rubbing paper like the baking paper. If you end up with a corner that you're just not happy with, that's just got a bit of a gap, you just can't get it right, then you can get a piece of scrap piece of leather, and on the grain side, that's the hair side, just pare a bit of leather off. So you just get a really, really thin piece of leather, a tiny piece, and soak that with paste, and just stick that over the corner and just work it down, and you can pretty much, it'll almost disappear. So it's got to be really, really thin, but it'll hide bad corners. So that's it for today. Just leave it on the edge of a bench or something to let the leather dry on the corners, put some barrier sheets in. I really want to thank everyone for the feedback on colours. There was one comment that was particularly interesting from Marla9 about the dark green and suggesting that Arbelave 2034 would be good. And I had to check that. My dark green's actually not 2034, it's darker than 2034. And I agree, 2034 would be really good. I just don't have any. So this is a sample book from Winterbottoms, who are a supplier to commercial users of bookcloth. So the colour that got the most votes is red. So we're going to go with red. So the next thing I'm going to decide on is what tooling I'm going to do. The Queensland Bookbinders Guild have a couple of rolls that come from an old government bindery where they did a lot of springbacks. So I've borrowed those two, and I'm either going to do them blind or in black carbon. I'm not going to put this one out for vote today. I'm just going to go with the chunkier pattern in carbon. And as always, if you've enjoyed today's video, please hit the big thumbs up button, and if you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. And until next time, cheerio.